No problem.
I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. Welcome everybody. We're just going to wait and get started at 7:30. We're just opening up right now to let you in and get settled. We are going to give another minute for people to come in. So welcome everybody who's here already. We are less than a minute away of beginning the first program of the Florida JCC Jewish Book Fest. Go ahead and settle in for a wonderful evening ahead. Welcome, everybody. We are thrilled that you have joined us for our Florida JCC's Jewish Book Fest. Our virtual festival will be October 8th through the 25th, and we are so happy that you're with us for our opening program with Thane Rosenbaum and Governor JebBush. This program is being presented through a partnership of 6 JCCs in Florida: the Alper JCC in South Miami, the Galbert Family JCC in Miami Beach, Adolph and Rose Levis JCC in Boca Raton, the David Posnack JCC in Fort Lauderdale, the Roth JCC in Orlando, and the Michael Ann Russell JCC in North Miami Beach. I am Debbie Hockman, and I am the Director of Arts, Culture, and Education at the David Posnack JCC in Fort Lauderdale. Tonight's program is going to be a conversation about the book, Saving Free Speech from Itself, with the author Thane Rosenbaum and Governor JebBush. This conversation was recorded earlier today. At the end of the conversation, Thane Rosenbaum will be live with us to answer your questions. So as our conversation is going on, please type any of your questions into the Q&A feature. We will attempt to get to all the questions, but we ask your understanding if time doesn't allow us to get to everyone. And if you haven't already purchased this book, we encourage you to visit our partners at Books and Books and the Writer's Block, and we will have a link for the purchase in our chat room, and we'll send this out after the program as well. So that great news is having Thane and Governor JebBush here, because Thane, this is his 3rd appearance with us from the David Posnack JCC, and I know you're going to really enjoy him, and we are so happy that he has come back for this book. Thane Rosenbaum is an essayist, novelist, and law professor, and he serves as a legal analyst for CBS News Radio and can be seen regularly on various cable news shows. He moderates the talk show at the 92nd Street Y, which is an annual series on culture, world events, and politics, and he has given public lectures around the world. Thane is a distinguished university professor at Touro College, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. And we're honored that Governor JebBush agreed to have this conversation tonight, and he's with us for the first time. He also has written 3 books, so we hope that maybe on another book tour, he'll come and join us again. But as most of our audience is aware, Jeb Bush was the 43rd governor of the state of Florida, serving from 1999 through 2007. He was most recently a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 2016. Governor Bush currently serves as chairman of Finback Investments Partners, LLC, and Dock Square Capital, LLC, both merchant banks headquartered in Coral Gables. Governor Bush maintains his passion for improving the quality of education for students across the country by serving as chairman of the Foundation for Excellence in Education, which is a national nonprofit education reform organization he founded to transform education in America. And Governor Bush lives in Miami with his wife, Columba. So I hope you will enjoy this conversation between Thane Rosenbaum and Governor Jeb Bush. And please remember, any questions, put them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. And we look forward to greeting Thane afterwards with your questions.
Basis. But one of the things in a pandemic, when we're all quarantined, that you should be doing is reading. My mom taught me that reading was like the most important value that you should share. And so here's the deal. What I do is I use my Kindle to read, and then I buy a book at an independent bookstore to be able to provide support and send that book to somebody to read. So I hope that all of you today will buy Thane's book and maybe buy another book for a friend, so that we get through this smarter, more literate, and more together when we find a vaccine, which is hopefully going to happen soon. So this is a book, a really interesting book, Saving Free Speech from Itself. And one of the things that I thought was really remarkable was you have people like Bernard Henry Levy, Nadine Strawson, Bret Stephens, who consider themselves First Amendment absolutists, all writing pretty glowing tributes to your book, which I thought was remarkable. Because normally when people talk about their books, they kind of endorse the book. But I love the fact, and it's a First Amendment book, I love the fact that you had people that didn't completely agree with you, but thought the book was worthwhile. Maybe we should start there, because I think that's kind of what the conflict of the First Amendment and free speech gets down to, that basic right, to respect other people's views.
So well said, Jeb. First of all, I want to thank you for joining me in doing this for the Jewish Book Fairs. I just want to say, working on your campaign for the presidency was one of the true privileges of my life. The last 4 years, honestly, Jeb, not a day goes by that I don't think, what if? I just want you to know, I think about it all the time. And frankly, the way you introduced the evening about trying to keep us all safe, you know, there's a Yiddish word for you, you know, Governor Mensch. That was very much always you. I remember when I brought you to NYU to light Hanukkah candles with students.
Yeah.
And I must tell everyone from, you know, the Jews of South Florida, you know, these students at NYU were literally, Jeb delivered this incredible, you know, talk about Israel and about what it means to be a Jewish American. And the students were jumping all over him. There was such sense of affection. I remember standing in the back with such pride. That was my friend Jeb, the former governor of Florida, here at NYU, for all the politics, the trouble that they have. The Jews of Florida, Jews of NYU showed up to Hillel when Jeb Bush came to light Hanukkah candles. So Jeb, thank you.
And by the way, Thane, that was at a time when there were activists against the students. They were threatened.
Yes.
The BSD movement was large, you know, was actually pretty active at NYU, which has a very large Jewish population, but it didn't stop people trying to repress speech.
Exactly.
And I was really impressed with the students standing on principle, actively advocating their position, even though there were pressures for them to be stifled.
Right.
Which again, is one of the reasons why I think this book's important.
Well, I love that you picked up on the idea that I had First Amendment absolutists endorsing the book, because they essentially believed in freedom of speech. And the real question is, do we have it anymore? Does it really exist? And does it exist in the way that our founding fathers imagined it for us? For instance, maybe we'll talk later, if we can, about the first presidential debate that was a few weeks ago. Because I can assure you is not what our founding fathers imagined, because they were very much interested in people reading books, coming up with ideas that they could contribute to the marketplace of ideas in a mutually respectful setting, a public square where there would lead to better decision making, there would be robust debate. I mean, this is really what our founding fathers had hoped for us. An opportunity for people to respect each other, to have their moment, to present their ideas, and for people to, through these discussions, through these debates, to advance science, culture, art, and good government, representative democracy. And so, in so many ways, what we saw, that debate, that non-debate, is even itself was an example of a kind of erosion of what it meant to have free speech. But let me just briefly say that what the book is saying is a couple things. First of all, we are an outlier when it comes to other liberal democracies. For instance, we all have, if you think of France, Germany, England, all the Western democracies, Israel, their tolerance for neo-Nazis marching on a community of Holocaust survivors, burning crosses on the lawns of African Americans, this is all legal under our constitutional interpretation. But we are an outlier. None of these other countries would tolerate marching Nazis, the alt-right at Charlottesville. We have the ACLU always representing those groups. So one question is, what makes us different? Why should we accept that? I'm of the view that marching Nazis make us look ridiculous, right? The book, that's one of the reasons it's controversial. And all the people that you cited a moment ago, Jeb, that endorsed the book, all disagree with me. They think we should have not march. So that's sort of one question. The second question is, well, why don't they allow that in those other countries? And that's because they believe in human dignity. What does it mean to be a citizen of a society? And one thing is not to be subject to degrading speech, signage that make you feel less of a human being, less of, as a citizen. There's a great quote in the book from Lyndon Johnson that says, a man has the right, I know you love this quote, a man has a right to go outside of his house with his children and not be humiliated. It's a great line. He's right. And so the book says two things. One, it says, shouldn't we introduce the idea of human dignity as a human right? And that unless you are actually speaking that is a true idea, not something that is supposed to incite violence or cause hate or make people feel threatened, that is not speech. That is not what our founding fathers believed they were doing. Again, they were talking about robust debate. If you have an idea, it belongs in the marketplace of ideas. If you're here to just show your hatred, to frighten and intimidate someone, that is not an idea, and it doesn't belong to be, it should not be safeguarded by the First Amendment. And then the other thing the book says is, look what's happened at universities, where we've lost free speech entirely because of trigger warnings and safe spaces, even in the public square. Again, remember, the First Amendment only involves the government preventing you from speaking. It doesn't stop each other from preventing you. So for instance, taking a knee, these are all examples of ways in which people really, do they really believe in free speech? Because on university campuses, outside speakers are shouted down, especially if you're a pro-Israel speaker, and that was the point that you were making at Hillel, that students were facing that at NYU. There are many examples in which speech no longer exists in the non-public sphere, in the private sphere. The New York Times just recently eliminated, people were forced to resign for publishing an op-ed by Senator Cotton from Arkansas, essentially agreeing with 58% of the American public that thought maybe the military should be brought in to quell the racial violence and the looting. And that was a cause for the editor of the New York Times op-ed section to resign. To me, that was a dark day in the day of the First Amendment. If the New York Times can't publish an op-ed by a U.S. senator, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, you have cases. I'll tell my own personal case. I've been canceled, and no one could really explain why. It was a really weird thing. They were.
Were you invited to a university and you were just?
Yeah, and they were ashamed, I guess, and then they couldn't explain why it was. I found out later it was because some students' feelings were hurt. I think I think.
Oh, that is it. That is exactly. I know it sounds bizarre, but having lived at universities this long, it is simply that. You know, let me just quickly introduce the idea that University of California Chancellor introduced the idea that there's some phrases should not be used anymore in the University of California system, such as Merry Christmas, because it might hurt someone's feelings. Or
let me give you the other example,
yeah,
a better example, because for 2 years, 1.5 years, I was a presidential professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. I can't repeat that 5 times without stuttering. It's a strange title, but my job really was to go on campus 8 to 10 times a year and talk to students as a conservative. And I thought, you know, President Gutman deserves some credit to kind of counter this idea that we narrow speech and somehow that's okay, that students shouldn't be subjected to a broad range of views, so long as it's not, you know, inciting all sorts of ugliness. That universities should be places where there's full expression and a robust discussion, and that people's feelings shouldn't be hurt if they actually interact with someone that doesn't that they don't agree with. So I think this book is really important for that reason. That it's on the one hand we need broad speech. On the other hand, we need to make sure on the extremes that we don't consider that, you know, the absolutist view actually creates the narrowing of speech in the broadest way. And then the final thing I think is important is that we've lost a sense of shared identity as a nation. And so all of this then, you know, aggravates everything. The social media, the digitization of our lives, the ability to basically customize every piece of information you get that makes you more righteous about your own thinking and less tolerant about other people's thinking. We're in a dangerous time in that regard, and people are exploiting that. And the angst that comes out of it is pretty serious. So how far should speech rights go? What's if it's not absolute, that's an easy position to take with bad consequences. How far should it go so that we have a vibrant discussion about everything that's important?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a second, because you just made me think of something else when you mentioned that there's a real paradox here in the free speech universe, which is that on the one hand, the Constitution would protect the alt-right or the KKK or the neo-Nazis to essentially march. You remember what happened in Charlottesville with the alt-right burning crosses. That's protected because the government can't stop the KKK, right, from that message. At the same time, in non-governmental sphere, if you criticize Black Lives Matter, for instance, in any way, if you say anything, you could get fired. So why is it that we would protect the Klan? The Klan gets more protection. 3 professors this year, just this year alone, were subject to disciplinary actions because, are you ready for this? They quoted the N-word in speeches by Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, and a hip hop song. It was clearly not their use of the word, the N-word. They were quoting from Martin Luther King. That resulted in a disciplinary action. So here's an example. How is that, as you said, isn't this, as long as it's, what is that really doing? It's not threatening anyone. Is it hurting? The idea that that endangers African Americans to even have a white professor use the N-word in quoting Martin Luther King is just ludicrous. At the same time, we would protect Klansmen from burning a cross, which just makes no sense. So the answer to your question is, where are the limits? Look, we already know that free speech is not absolute. We know from Oliver Wendell Holmes, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. By the way, Jeb, you can shout fire in an empty theater. but that would you'd be crazy to do that. It wouldn't prove anything. But it's really the crowded theater that's the problem. And we know that obscenity isn't protected by the First Amendment, and libel and slander and defamation is not. Nor is something called the incitement to imminent lawlessness. I can't make a speech and then say, and we should all go attack, the Cubans of Miami, and then I walk away and everyone goes and attacks the Cubans of Miami. I can't claim I have First Amendment rights. That's called the incitement of imminent lawlessness. And there's something called fighting words, words that by definition, we never use this, we should. And my book argues that we should take advantage of this idea. That words that really are not about exposing the truth, they're there to just intimidate and cause a fight, have no value. They're just low value speech, and they should be considered non-speech. By the way, Jeb, we don't do that, but we have the constitutional possibilities of doing that. So we already know there are restrictions on speech. But short of that, we have, since the 1960s, expanded the role of how much speech. For the first 150 years of this country, there was much more prior restraints of speech. We were much more restricted, and people were okay with it. Something happened in the 1960s with the explosion of other civil liberties, that the First Amendment took on a new gravitas. It became the most important Bill of Rights, and it was always about maximizing. More speech was considered better than less speech, based on some false premise, one by Louis Brandeis, that good speech cancels out the bad speech. I don't know where that happens. If that were true, as I argue in my book, if that's true, why do we still have Nazis? Because the Nazis sort of lost the argument in World War II. So if you really believe that good speech cancels out bad speech, here's Exhibit A that doesn't work. We shouldn't have Nazis. We shouldn't have the Klan. That's what Civil War guaranteed. That's what the new constitutional amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, after Abraham Lincoln. Why do we still have the Klan? So it's clear that bad speech does not get canceled out by good speech. I would make the argument that, again, if speech is sincerely offered to raise an idea, it is accepted, it's welcome into the marketplace of ideas. If its purpose, however, is to frighten, intimidate, cause a lack of, rob people of citizenship and dignity, it does not deserve the same protection, and we should be no different from the European democracies that wouldn't allow it. In Europe, in Austria or Germany, if the neo-Nazis want to march, they march them straight to jail. And the United States would grant them a pulpit in any village green in any city in America.
So apart from just common sense, which is a nice, not everything should be legal. I would know the kind of speech that is hateful that we should reject out of hand. How do you regulate speech? You change the Constitution? Is that the path forward, so that you create the kind of vision what you're describing of the First Amendment?
Really good question. So in the book, I talk about the number of things that could happen. You don't have to actually go as far as in introducing. I would argue it wouldn't be a terrible idea to have a new constitutional amendment that provides a right to human dignity. By the way, the word dignity, Jeb, in the U.S. Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence doesn't appear one time. Not once is the word dignity. But in the European constitutions, they're all over the place. And it just shows you that they have a very different appreciation for mutual respect, respecting your neighbor, right? Showing a level of mutual respect. You may disagree with him or her, but you don't burn a cross across the street from this, on his lawn. So, so again, you don't have to have a constitutional amendment, but it wouldn't be terrible to introduce. Israel, by the way, has in their basic laws, it's not a constitution, they have a right to dignity. They don't actually have a right to free speech. They grant it, but it's not even in their basic laws. They have a right to human dignity. So that's one thing that can be done. The other idea is to introduce, here in the United States, any hate crime law gets overturned. It's always considered unconstitutional. So I don't know if you tried to do that when you were the governor for 2 terms, to say the state of Florida should have a statute that bans hate language, hate speech. If you did, Jeb, in all likelihood, it would have been if you tried it. By the way, did that ever come up in your 8 years?
I think there was efforts to increase penalties for hate crimes,
I see.
not necessarily hate speech.
Hate speech. Right. Well, right. That's true. There's a difference between hate crimes. Hate speech codes in the United States are said to be unconstitutional. I don't see why they should be. The argument that I think you were raising is, well, then how do you know what's hate speech, right? And I just don't have that problem in the way that other people do. Like, for instance, we ask juries to sit in on car crashes, personal injury, where vicious car crashes, and we ask 12 members of the jury who've never been in a vicious car crash to tell us what happened on that day, to develop the facts. Everyone's been humiliated, Jeb. Everyone has experienced a level of indignity where they're so broken, their spirit is broken. I don't think it is so difficult. And I think one other idea that I want to just get in for a second is the book is filled with a lot of the new medical science. Because the new medical science is overwhelming, Jeb, that it's what our legal system is sort of based on some bizarre children's lines, line. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. Well, first of all, children know that's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. Yes, sticks and stones can break your bones, but names also hurt. And so one of the things that medical science has proven in the last 5 years through neuroscience is that emotional distress, the stress that comes from indignity, humiliation, threats, intimidation, it's not just mental impairment, it's physical sickness. It causes inflammation and makes people sick. So we shouldn't be so dismissive over, well, unless you break your bones, you have no claim. So, that's another element to the book, to say that we shouldn't be dismissive of it because it's serious. And then the last thing I would say is constitutional amendment, hate speech codes. And the last thing is we already have constitutional cases, Jablonski versus the United States, which introduces the idea of fighting words and introduces the idea that words that have no value and are only there to cause harm do not receive the same treatment as speech. We're just not using those constitutional lessons. We're just ignoring them in order to provide more speech rather than less.
Do you think that the founders, in writing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, assumed that the protection, these were protections from government, which is unique? I don't think any other constitution, basically, constitutions kind of guarantee all sorts of things that they can't deliver in most countries. Ours is a means by which we protect liberty and we protect ourselves from an overreaching government. But the underlying assumption had to have been that we were always going to be a self-governing people, and that dignity would come from that rather than from prescribing it in a document.
Right. No, it's a good point. But it would be the same. Yeah, and it's an interesting point. I mean, I love how you frame that. Our Constitution is really based on negative rights, not positive rights. It's really what the government can't do to you. It's not what the government gives you, it's what they can't do to you, which explains why Nazis have the right to march, or the Klan has the right to march, but we would take much stronger positions in the public sphere against Colin Kaepernick, for instance, right? Where, or Roseanne Barr was fired from having her television show because of a tweet. Lawrence Sterling, I think his name, lost his team, the Los Angeles Clippers, because his girlfriend surreptitiously recorded a conversation that he had. So in many ways, we don't believe in free speech. We're willing to punish people for some things that they've said, but it's not about the government. That's our own punishing each other.
Yeah, but that guy, his name was Sterling, and the poor guy had to sell his team for $2 billion.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. That's how Ballmer ended up with the team, right?
Yeah.
That's how, right. Yeah. So I'm saying in that is that we those are examples where we say we believe in free speech, but it's only because we don't want the government to interfere with our speech. We don't seem to mind telling other people what they can say and what they can't say, which is what we're seeing on campuses or what we're seeing in the public sphere, things that we're not permitted to say.
Well, talk to me about the hypocrisy of this, because it becomes a vicious cycle. So if some left-wing group restricts speech, threatens people for maybe the college Republicans, if they're still around, they're intimidated, they can't speak, or the college Republicans will invite a provocateur. I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's 2 or 3 of these guys that come on campuses to create crisis, to create chaos. And then the left responds in a Pavlovian way, and then the right, all of these are people from outside of the campus, by the way. The right then feels aggrieved, and we have what we have. We have we have Portland.
Right.
And so how do we get out of that without undermining civil liberties in this country that I still think are worth protecting? I mean,
I agree, Governor. Look, one thing is that we should take a very hard position that if your presence is there, again, to intimidate, to threaten, to incite, to rob people of dignity, you are not protected under the First Amendment. That's if you want to write an op-ed, that's one thing. If you want to have signs that say Muslims go home, you don't have a First Amendment right for that. That is not an idea, right? And that's where I take a very hard line. What we've essentially said, Jeb, which is so, to me, crazy, is that anything out of the mind of a lunatic could be considered an idea. And I'm saying, no, and we know what an idea is. Why are we elevating Muslims go home, to an idea? We know what there's no idea there. If you have an argument to make about, Islam's endorsement of terrorism, that you write an article. It's an argument that you can make. Or by the way, that is an argument in the global sphere where you can't make it because you saw what happened with the Danish cartoons and the Charlie Hebdo cartoons in France. That any cartoons about that mock the Prophet Muhammad would be resulted for many people essentially a death sentence. Meanwhile, the Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, plays to sold-out houses all over America and the West, and the Mormons don't respond in the same way. Why? Because it's a musical, and there are ideas in the musical. And I love, in the book, I have a quote from them that on the opening night of the Book of Mormon, they didn't threaten to bomb the Broadway theater. On the opening night, they took out an ad in the playbill, Jeb, and it says, "You've now seen the musical. Now come to one of our churches and see the religion." Right? Right. I mean, that's saying we respect the right of this Broadway producers to make a mockery of us because they're making fun of some of our ideas, but it doesn't mean we get to cancel them out. But going back to your founding fathers, you're right. Their expectation wasn't, if you said to George Washington, if you imagine this, right? You have a brother and a dad who were the president of the United States. Your dad had this incredible military record. We know what George Washington did for a living before he became president. If you said to George Washington in 1797, let's say, just before the end of his second term, said, "Oh, by the way, in the future, President Washington, you'll be able to burn an American flag in front of a family that just lost their son in combat, and that would be considered, of course, free speech under our Constitution," he would say you're out of your mind. He would
go into more detail about the Wayside Baptist Church.
Yeah, right.
I mean, because that's a perfect example of not an idea. That is just people that want to hurt people in their most vulnerable time, the saddest time of their lives.
So in the book, Jeb, I really tee off on one Supreme Court case, even more so than the neo-Nazi case, Collin versus Smith, which I don't like, obviously. But Snyder versus Phelps, to me, is Exhibit A for my book. Snyder versus Phelps is about the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas. And they are so upset about the decision for gays serving in the military that they have a mission where they travel around the country to the funerals of dead Marines. By the way, they don't care if the Marine was gay or not. They don't ask. It doesn't matter. They just want to make a point. They get a permit and they hold up signs that says, "God hates fags. God hates 9/11. Thank God for 9/11. These are their signs. Why? They are protesting the service of gays in the military. And they want, that's how they do it. And so Snyder versus Phelps, the father of this dead Marine, brought a emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil action against the church. He received from a local jury in Kansas several $1 million, which got overturned. The Supreme Court, ready for this? 8-1 voted in favor of the church over the father. It's not just over. What's that? Right. Not over.
Who was the dissent? Who was the one?
Alito. Justice Alito was the one in dissent, and he was the one that would have said what I said. Are you bananas? Well, first of all, it wasn't just the father. A state court jury ruled. It was a jury that gave the man $2 million. They basically overrode the right of a state court jury, states' rights in Kansas, for the jury to award the man this award. And it's worse than that. The court required, I think it was Mr. I can't remember who the father was, the father to pay court costs. So the father not only lost the ability to receive the damage award, but 8-1. And again, that to me is lunacy. That if we really believe that James Madison, who drafted the Constitution, or Alexander Hamilton, or Thomas Jefferson, all the people that debated the First Amendment, you really think that these learned men who read the enlightened philosophers, Locke, Rousseau, Hume, Kant, that they thought God hates fags is what the First Amendment was for? Oh, by the way, one last thing. If you read the personal letters that went back between the Founding Fathers, this is what they said about the first free speech, repeatedly. This is what they said that we forgot. Of course, there should be free speech, provided that it does not conflict with other rights owed to citizens. We lost that whole idea. Yes, free speech, but if it means that it tramples over your rights to be an actual citizen, no, you don't have a free speech right, but we have lost that entire idea.
Yeah, this is now playing out more because people are comfortable with trampling over people.
Yes.
I mean, this is the world we're in now, and I think having discussions about our freedoms now are important because they're being encroached on one level, and that you have to earn it. Our freedoms have to be earned. They're not. If we don't act in the proper way ourselves, if the 330 million of us don't interact amongst ourselves in the proper way, then we'll lose it. It won't necessarily be by Supreme Court ruling. It will be by the mob taking over. And I mean, I watch the political discourse now. I'm pleased we'll still get into the presidential race. I'm out of therapy and I'm happy there. But just in terms of watching the political discourse not be about lifting people up, connecting with them when they're suffering as they are right now, giving people hope that there's going to be a better day, having ideas to make that happen. Those things are pushed down, and grievance and anger and hatred become more dominant. And making, because someone disagrees with you, they're not only wrong, they could be evil.
Yeah.
And so I mean, the book, it's timely. Your book is timely to maybe have a conversation about how we protect these liberties.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are living in this, you're right, the cancellation culture, but it's the point that you made before is the really excellent point, which is we lost the concept of, I disagree with your point, right? That was a simple idea that went on for a couple hundred years. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I disagree. Now we see this on social media. I see this with many of my essays. People respond to some of my essays as if I deserve moral condemnation, right? The mere fact that you're even raising the point strips you of any moral purity. And everyone walks around with such a sense of smug censorship that I have the right to tell you, and it's not that you're wrong, but that you are beyond redemption. It's beyond the pale. The concept of what it means to be a liberal, right? To me, a liberal, which is why, that's why when the left, the far left say they're liberal, they're not, they're progressives. They should be called progressives because liberals mean essentially what it means, open. It means you're open to conflicting ideas. You're willing to hold two different ideas in two hands and to make a judgment a decision about them. It means a certain level of calmness, deliberation, coolness, not craziness. That is what it means to have the liberal mind. That's what a liberal arts degree means, right? That's why in universities it's so ironic when they give a liberal arts degree, but they disinvite speakers like JebBush. How can you give liberal arts degrees if you're actually telling certain speakers, as sober a man as you are, that your presence on campus could be problematic for someone's hurt feelings? Obviously,
I've been invited to a lot of places, and what I find remarkable, I spoke at Harvard. I taught a class and spoke at Harvard for 3 weeks.
Was this at the Kennedy School, Jeb?
Yeah, and I spoke at Harvey Mansfield's class. He's this phenomenal, well-known. He's a conservative historian and American history professor of incredible reputation. So I spoke, and this beautiful African-American student, freshman at Harvard College, came up to me afterwards and said, Governor Bush, I'm really interested in conservative philosophy. I've never heard a conservative speak. I'd like to know more. So here's a girl that grew up in New York City, incredibly well educated, obviously, smart as a whip to get into Harvard, and she had never even accessed a different point of view. So I think it's important for us to kind of reweave the web of civility and take your point, which is that liberalism, not the political philosophy, but the idea of protecting freedom and liberty, we need to focus on it, and we need to, Arthur Brooks talks about this in his books. So when you go on Twitter and you're angry about something, every time you go after somebody, you ought to say 4 kind things about somebody else. The undergirding all this has to be a degree of civility and a set of shared values. And I'm so happy that you've written this book. I think we're nearing the end of our journey here. Anything else you would like to add other than go buy 10 copies for the holidays?
Well, I do want to say, I want to bring you back into this conversation, is that, you, in so many ways in your public life, embody what I think the Founding Fathers had in mind. Certain levels of just, moral decency, civic decency, mutual respect, kindness. I'll never forget when you withdrew from the campaign. I know you don't want to talk a lot about this. I just want to say, the article in the New York Times about your withdrawal from the campaign is so extraordinary, because the woman who had covered you for 9 months basically said she could not believe how incredibly gracious you were, even when she asked tough questions, how willing you were to listen to people that had disagreed with you, how you were reflective, right? Not impulsive, but reflective. This is what the Founding Fathers really wanted for us. They believed that a marketplace of ideas, robust debate will all make us better. They wanted to end divisiveness and polarization. As you pointed out, we're living in a time of a maximized, accentualized polarization where there is no middle. There's no openness to the possibility that I've never given this some thought, let me give it some. No one ever says a sentence like that. You know what, I haven't thought of that way. Let me give it, I'll get back to you in a few. Who talks like that? Now it's immediately you're shouting the other person down. He'll never get invited to dinner again. Can you believe this guy? We refuse to accept each other's opinions. And at the same time, we have a legal system that this is the irony, right? That the legal system protects the real bullies, the ones that are really there to cause mayhem and to cause violence and to truly frighten people. But the civility amongst ourselves has disappeared, evaporated. We don't allow it anymore. So that the government, somehow the legal system, only gives it for people who are speaking in the language of hate, which just makes no sense. And I think that we should try to remember that this isn't really what the Founding Fathers had in mind, and that we should honor that the spirit of what it meant to be open to each other's ideas, mutual respect, and at the same time to recognize when you grant someone dignity, when you grant someone some citizenship, you're also granting them the dignity of what citizenship means. to participate as a full member of society, to be able to come to the public square without being told that you have to defend your right to live, right? You know, that you have to defend your very existence. And that's why, you know, what's one of the interesting anecdotes that's in the book was that in 1977, when the ACLU represented the Nazis in Skokie, the ACLU also represented the alt-right in Charlottesville. What's interesting is 1977, because they represented the neo-Nazis, they lost a lot of donations, especially from Jews. Ironically, Jeb, most people don't know, most of the lawyers for the ACLU who represented the neo-Nazis were Jews. Right? Talk about twisted, right? Jewish lawyers represented the neo-Nazis less than 30 years after Auschwitz. But after Charlottesville, after the killing in Charlottesville, 200 lawyers for the ACLU wrote a letter to the executive director. This is unprecedented, and said, why are we doing this? Why are we in the business of representing these people? Shouldn't we be interested in equality? Why are we instead representing literally the bad guys, the guys that are causing with the tiki torches and Jews will not replace us? And I don't know if that signals a change, Jeb. I don't know what it means, but it is an anecdote worth thinking about, that even the ACLU had second thoughts.
Thane, I hope that people dig deep into your book, Saving Free Speech from Itself. It's a phenomenal read, and I wish you great success, and continue to stay in the public square advocating these powerful ideas, please.
Jeb, you're always an inspiration. You are deeply loved by many Floridians and many Americans. Please always know that.
Debbie, back to you. I hope everybody stays safe.
Good. Okay, welcome. Marjorie Marcus is an award-winning English teacher, retired from the Broward County Public School System after a long and successful career as a district-level administrator.
I don't know what that is.
She's taught English at every grade level from middle school to graduate school, currently focusing on lecturing for adult university.
Sounds like another program. There we go. Okay. So Thane, thank you so much. And as we said earlier, so Thane is here with us to answer your questions live. And we really appreciate that conversation you had with Governor Bush. It was really wonderful. And I'm going to go ahead and there were a couple questions here, Thane. They kind of all were around the same topic, which is Facebook. So let me read the first one. Please discuss social media platforms like Facebook and its responsibility to the First Amendment and its responsibility to protect safety of the people who are on these platforms.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I really enjoyed having that talk with Jeb, and I hope the Jews and non-Jews of Florida who were watching that really enjoyed that, because I think we both had fun. It's something I normally say is, I'm actually from Florida. I may be in Brooklyn now, but I'm a Floridian, and I'm very sorry that I wasn't given a chance this time to see people personally. I missed out on that because of the pandemic, but I hope I'm pretty sure there'll be more books, and I hope if you invite me back, I will see you in person. So thank you, Debbie. Well, Facebook is a complicated issue. You remember what I said with Jeb, that the Europeans wouldn't put up with neo-Nazis marching into communities of Holocaust survivors. Guess what? The Europeans wouldn't put up with Facebook and YouTube in the same way either. They are much more strict than we are here. Again, we have a kind of very strong First Amendment ethos, and so virtually there is, we've been told by Mark Zuckerberg that he doesn't want to get involved in playing any role as a censor. And so he says really stupid, irresponsible things, like when he was confronted with the question, why are you allowing Holocaust denial on Facebook? His response was, well, we don't censor people for simply getting their facts wrong, right? Which is just ridiculous. It's not that he makes it sound like the Nazis haven't read enough books. And if they simply read more books, they wouldn't hate Jews. Their mind is not made up fully. So if we let them on Facebook, they might change their mind. It was just idiotic. But I think for him, his view is that, let Facebook be like the Wild West with no restrictions at all, no regulation. And so, and with the possibility there'll be more ads that come from that. So it's a complicated thing. The Tsarnaev brothers, let's say, for YouTube, remember the Boston Marathon bombers? They learned how to make that bomb watching YouTube in their kitchen in Boston. The Europeans think we're out of our minds, that they have actually European Union rules. They're not going to let you learn how to make a bomb in your kitchen. And so again, this is a part of a First Amendment ethos, what I would call a First Amendment craziness, a free speech craziness that we have that Europe doesn't have, and we see it in many ways. Yes, I'm in favor of much more regulation of the internet on multiple grounds for many reasons, but among which is that since it has become its own news provider, it's, as we learned from the 2016 election, it became a way to actually manipulate our elections by creating truly fake news. And the question is, shouldn't we require, since they want to also play the role as a news information gathering place, shouldn't we require them to have a level of at least the responsibility that we would require of any regular newspaper? Because remember, the difference between the public square and a newspaper and Facebook is that only of those three, Facebook is the only one that can control what you see. So when they say it's not open for everyone. The algorithm they figure out what to show you. And that is incredibly manipulative. And it makes it impossible for people to regulate it themselves. It either comes from them or comes from nobody, because nobody who's on Facebook can actually control it. The algorithm will tell you what it is we think you should see. So yes, it's in my view, it's the real problem. It's another example of the ways in which we are not like the Europeans, and that we hold, again, we are incredibly sensitive to censorship, right? That's the point I was making with Jeb. When it comes to governmental regulators, or for that matter, Facebook, we don't want anyone to regulate what we see. But when it comes to dealings with each other, we censor each other all the time. So let's be consistent. Either we believe in free speech or we don't believe in free speech. I would say with respect to the internet, we oftentimes are being fed false information that the entities know is false. They know it's false, and they're still supplying it to us.
There are a couple more questions similarly asking about, what do you think is a responsibility for them to monitor and block propaganda, but I think you just covered that. So.
Well, I just think that, again, the Europeans don't have this problem because they have passed legislation, and they want, for instance, in Europe, Facebook has to hire, I forgot the number of people, but it's a huge number of people, and their job is simply to go through all the posts to weed them out. So in America, Facebook doesn't have to spend that money, right? In Europe, they've got hundreds out of thousands. I can't remember what the names of the people. And let me tell you something else, Debbie. When those people are being interviewed about their jobs, they claim they're miserable because they actually see the hatred, right? They're the ones up front who sees the ways in which people are actually violating common decency. Your whole day is to look through this garbage and to weed them out. Well, guess what? In America, we really don't have anybody doing that. It's the Wild West.
There's a question here from Marjorie Howell. I don't know if I said her name right, but she's asking, what's the line between being politically correct and free speech? People are being fired for not being politically correct. Isn't that a violation of free speech?
Yeah, Marjorie, it's a great question. And I tried to touch a little of that on my talk with Jeb. Yes, that's part of the paradox, right? Again, in the private sphere, there are many examples like what Marjorie's describing. People being fired, people being canceled for saying something that you're just simply not permitted to say anymore. But remember, the First Amendment operates only for prior restraints, meaning its purpose is the government shall not prohibit, restrict your speech, right? That's the rule. So if two people are friends and one person says something to the other person and he says, I can't believe you said that to me. And the other one says, well, you know, it's a free country. I can say whatever I want. That's not what the First Amendment says. I mean, you can say whatever you want, but your friend can drop you as a friend. But it's not because the First Amendment protects you. The First Amendment only protects you from speaking when the government is stopping you. So yes, in the other spheres that Marjorie's talking about, and that's why we talked about, like, you know, Roseanne Barr losing her job, or I described, you know, New York Times editors losing their jobs. This is relatively new, right? Where we're really regulating in a social context, not in a legal context, in a social context. We're censoring and regulating speech if it is politically incorrect, if it violates intersectional norms on campuses, if it's a trigger warning, if it's a microaggression, right? These are the new terms of art. If it's not woke, right? That was the line I said before. It was a provocative line. Jeb didn't bite because Jeb is too gracious not to bite. But I said it happens to be true. I'll say it again. There would be tremendous damage to your career today if you said anything negative about Black Lives Matter. Now, it's a political movement. It's filled with ideas. It's rich in ideas. Because of that, people should be able to have a conversation about it. I can say right to you, because I'm fairly fearless, but if you mention the words black on black crime today, Marjorie she should know, don't do that, Marjorie, because even raising the question is politically incorrect. Whereas it's a very important question, right? I mean, these are things, this is what the Founding Fathers said. We will become better decision makers and better policy makers if we come to the public square and debate ideas. But Marjorie is correct that there is no real free speech when it comes to debating ideas that are deemed politically incorrect. Should we? Yes. My book is a manifesto about we have lost, you know, this other idea, pro-Israel speakers on campuses get shouted down. I know this for a fact because I'm one of them. So for instance, I, you know, travel around the country and I'm known as a person who has things to say that are positive in Israel and raising about moral failings of the Palestinian people. You can't say this and you will be shouted down. Well, for a country that purports to be fixated on free speech, obviously it's not true. Certainly not on campuses, and certainly if it's not politically correct.
There's another question about going to the Founding Fathers, so you kind of went right to it, which is really about what would they think if they were dropped into today's world, and,
Wow.
and to see exactly what they started, you know, where it's gone and that type of thing.
Yeah, I love that question. It's a really good question. People don't ask that question enough. You know, I intimated this when I was speaking with Jeb. You know, they simply did not believe that free speech trounces everything else. That is clearly not what they thought. That free speech would usurp or supersede other rights, because that is simply what we have today and what we've had for 50 years, since the 1960s. We've had a radical shift in what free speech means. And just to a large extent, you know, that case that Jeb was asking me about, Snyder versus Phelps, is a really amazing example, right? The Supreme Court 8-1 voted that the church had superseding rights to ruin the funeral of a father who's saying goodbye to his son for the last time, who died fighting in combat, because they want to protest gays serving in the military. Hey, his son's not even gay, but they have superseding rights to the father's right to say goodbye to his son. I mean, this to me is just utterly crazy. And there is no way that the Founding Fathers believe that. Why? Well, first of all, they would have said, whoa, what happened to like intelligent debate? What happened to actually making an argument, backing it up with something that you've read, right? I mean, that's what I was saying before about these are learned, well-read men who read books on the Enlightenment, and they read other constitutions, and they came to debate what should be in our Constitution. They thought that would be a model for what the citizens would do, right, in expressing their own views about public policy. It would never occur to them, right? I'm sure that James Madison would throw up if he saw, you know, the debate last week. I'm sure he would throw up. He wouldn't believe that what we call, you know, First Amendment freedoms is something would never have occurred to him. I'm pretty sure they would never have permitted flag burning. That would have made no sense to them. The United States, very clear, Texas versus Johnson. It's a political statement. You can't deprive someone of their opportunity to protest in that way. By the way, we've seen a complete shift with the kneeling with the national anthem. In the book, I talk about it. It's funny how the difference a year makes. In the book, I talk about how the owners were restricting the players from taking a knee. And so Colin Kaepernick, you know, was sort of on the outside of this. Obviously, life now has changed. You know, Debbie, you still with me? Oh. You know, has changed, but the idea was that, well, people would say, well, doesn't Colin Kaepernick have a First Amendment right? He does have a First Amendment right, but not on the job, right? You know, not the owners of his team have every right to decide how players stand at attention. The way the First Amendment would work with taking a knee is if the state of Florida, when Jeb was, you know, governor, I might have asked him this, if they passed a law in Florida that said at all football games or sporting events during the playing of the national anthem, everyone must stand at attention. That is if that is a First Amendment violation. But if the owner of the team says, I want you dressed in a suit on the plane off and on, and in the stadium, I want you at attention. I don't want you in your knee. It's his team, and he's allowed to do that. Now, again, that's changed because of the politics of the moment, where now the owners are afraid to not honor that. But originally, they were right. They had the right to decide whether you get to change, and it's not a First Amendment issue. If Colin Kaepernick wanted to leave the stadium and do some protest somewhere else, that's something else. But in the stadium, you're on the clock.
Do you want to take one more question, or are you?
I'm happy to talk to my Floridian friends. Whatever is best for everybody.
There was another one question that came in was, how can we provide a platform for civil discourse in our communities?
Well, you know, that is, you know, that's the problem that we have, obviously. We can't pass a law, right? We can't require people to be nice to each other. What I do think we could do is what Jeb and I were talking about, is to once more remind everybody what the purpose of the First Amendment was, what the founding fathers was. Civility matters. Having, you know, there's a way to overcome the restrictions on speech with something called time, place, and manner restrictions, whereas there's some restrictions that even if it affects the viewpoint, the government can actually restrict speech because, let's say, time of day, right? Or can't do it in front of children, whatever. There's always rules you can do. But when I think of time, place, and manners, I also think of manners, you know, the manner of how it's being spoken, right? There's a difference between saying Jews will not replace us, right, with tiki torches and wearing combat fatigues at night, and raising, you know, writing an op-ed about, I think that, you know, whatever it is that you want to make a policy position, you know, about, there's a big difference between, you want to take a policy position on Israel and the Palestinians, that's different from shouting speakers down. That's very different, you know, from threatening students from taking any kind of position, prejudicing students because they happen to be Jews. This level of civility we've completely lost. And it used to be, you know, the Lincoln Douglas debates. We had a history, a tradition where people could be respectful to each other and, you know, live to disagree and live to fight another day. And as I was saying earlier, that's what's been lost. Right now, it's a combat. You don't grant anybody any time. I mean, in the last debate, you know, the president really didn't want to hear from Joe Biden. You know, I'm not sure, you know, it's the combat way that we've communicated. And so you're right, there is no civility in discourse. but it's partly because we just forgot. And I think that somebody, the public sphere, this is where governmental leaders needs to remind us of this, because we've learned something else. Partisan politics, if you watch Fox or CNN, MSNBC, I mean, that's actually another very important thing that I talk about in the book. You know, there used to be a rule, a statute, that basically required that if you were a news service, CBS, NBC, a newspaper, your obligation was, it wasn't equal time, but it was an obligation to present a multiplicity of views. And that law has been rescinded. And that's why you see Fox only saying one thing and CNN saying one thing the rescinding of that statute and that level of case law has been a huge mistake, because it used to be, we never knew what you know, in the old days, Walter Cronkite, did anyone know if he was a Democrat or a Republican? We didn't know these things because he couldn't, right? That was the point, the impartiality. I mean, President, you know, Trump is not wrong when he's talking about fake news. I'm sorry, you know, I'm a Democrat, but I can actually say, I can see the manipulative ways that the news is being delivered, which is not in an attempt to actually provide both sides of the issue so people can become better informed. We've lost this capacity on multiple levels. Political leaders don't speak this way, the press doesn't operate this way, and neighbors don't communicate with each other that way.
So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap for tonight. And I thank you so much for being with us again. And we look forward to seeing you another time, hopefully in our neighborhoods where we can actually be face-to-face with you. And
bye, Florida.
We really appreciate that you were able to get JebBush to be here with you in conversation, because that was a wonderful forum that you guys put together.
I also thought I wanted, you know, that was a rough campaign. And it was during a period, as you just pointed out, where insulting people became vogue, right? The 2016 campaign was all about insults. And that was just that is not an arena for a dignified man. And JebBush is a decent, dignified man. And it was really that story has not been told. It will be years from now about what that was like. Because again, mutual respect, common decency was lost. And I personally wanted, you know, I don't know how often Floridians get to see Jeb. And I thought, you know what, if they're going to see me, I want them to see Jeb.
No, that was a treat. And you could see the relationship that you had and your mutual respect. And I think that was really a wonderful conversation. So thank you for creating that and having us be a part of that with you tonight. So that was wonderful. So and on that note, I do encourage everybody here to purchase your book. And if they already have it, that they should also go ahead and get a copy of Saving Free Speech from Itself for all their friends and family, just like JebBush had said as well. And I'm going to ask everybody to please join us again on Sunday, October 11th, when we are hosting author Jill Wine-Banks. And she is going to be discussing her book, The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President. She is going to be in discussion with Dr. Antonio Fins, who's the politics editor at the Palm Beach Post. And if you haven't already purchased your tickets, please visit any of the 6 JCC websites. And we look forward to seeing you again on Sunday, October 11th at 7:30. So on behalf of all the South Florida JCCs, actually not South Florida JCCs, all the Florida JCCs, have a great night.